Hello everyone and welcome to my channel. I'm so happy to have you here. This time I will talk about Red Dead Redemption 2 and why I think that it is the greatest game ever made. This will be done by looking into the story, features and mechanics of the game, characters, the open world, and many other things. Let us begin. When I first started the game, it felt so different than your average video game. Everything felt much bigger. One is introduced to this gang that is running away from something or someone ambiguous. The player is just vaguely informed that there was some bad business in a place called Blackwater, and then hooked in to find out more about it. I was so intrigued to find out what happened. Then we were introduced to the Vanderlyn gang, and some of the most important characters in the entire game. The player is of course the main protagonist of the game called Arthur Morgan, who first rides with Dutch, the leader of the gang. He seems like a charismatic character, who at first glance takes care of everyone and cares about his people. The player is introduced to the basic mechanics of the game: horse riding, how to speed up, how to slow down. And all of this is done in an incredible setting. There was a huge snowstorm that separated some of the gang members from each other. Dutch and Arthur set out to scout, and in the process meet Micah, another gang member who will turn out to be one of the crucial figures in the entire game. He looked raw, brash, and ill-mannered. You can check out my analysis of Arthur, Micah, and Dutch in separate videos I made of them. Let us continue. The trio then moved to investigate the noise coming from the nearby house. There the player is introduced to our main rival gang, the O'Driscolls. One does not know much about them, if anything. However, this is the first time the player engages in a gunfight, and it felt so satisfying. It gave a sense of being in an actual gunfight in a Wild West. Eventually, the gang picks up another character, namely Sadie Adler, whose husband was killed and whose house was burnt down. An incredible introduction to the game indeed. It felt like a movie set. Red Dead Redemption 2 is truly a breathtaking game. The mechanics are GTA-like in many ways, which makes sense, considering Rockstar made all of those games. Graphics are incredible, weather effects even better. Even in the introduction to the game, one could see the snow falling, the wind blowing that same snow, characters' clothes being covered in it. While walking through the snow, there are footsteps and marks left from the player. When you shoot someone, there is blood left on the snow. Upon completing the prologue, the player is then introduced to the rest of the gang. One needs to go through a sort of a tutorial when it comes to fighting, gunfighting, and hunting. The gang goes on a hunt for O'Driscolls, whose location was revealed through the torturing of one of their members who was captured. There, the player kills all of them, while being introduced to one of the most important mechanics of the entire game, called the Deadeye. It's a feature that the player can use to slow time in a way. The enemies are moving much slower, while Arthur can be much quicker than them. That allows one to tag them and shoot them in any body part you desire. If you shoot them in their head, their hats drop off, and there is a sort of a cutscene showing the person killed and Arthur. And this feature is so cool. It reminded me of those old Western movies where characters would engage in a duel. It felt as if the time slowed down, and then everything would be over in a second. Of course, that was done with Quick Draw, which is a different feature altogether. that was also introduced later on in the game. The point is, Deadeye rules, and it's an overkill. But of course, the player cannot use Deadeye infinitely. It needs to be recharged, and one needs to be careful not to damage the core. This can be done by consuming some products. The products that can be consumed range from whiskeys, cigarettes, cookies, fruit, food, tonics, etc. In addition, the player is introduced to the health and stamina they possess. These also get depleted and can be refilled. One is also given a horse that can move quickly or slowly, depending on the player's desires. Of course, our protagonist Arthur Morgan first carries a revolver, as any gunslinger would. However, then one is also given a bow that we are supposed to use for hunting. The player is taught that the best way to hunt animals is silently, as not to spook them. Charles, a Native American, teaches us how to hunt properly. Then the two of them go for deer hunting, because the gang is not only freezing in a snowstorm, but also starving, and they need food fast. Hunting is one of the things the player can do whenever they want. They can hunt legendary animals if they wish to do so, and then later sell what they extract from them to the butcher. The prologue itself feels like a tutorial, where the player needs to get to grips with the most important mechanics of the game, as well as to get to know the characters in the gang, such as John Marston, who one needs to save from wolves, Javier, Abigail, Jack, Hosea, Karen, Kieran, Susan, Molly, Lenny, Pearson, Charles, Dutch, and Micah. Of course, the player learns of the tragic deaths of a few other gang members. One could understand that the gang is on the run, and that they had to move as soon as it stopped snowing. And that's what they did. The gang found a new place they could settle in, and establish a camp. Red Dead Redemption 2 is of course an open-world game, which means the player does not have to proceed with the main story immediately, but can do whatever they want. They could go exploring, hunting, drinking, robbing. Later on in the game, the player is introduced to many other options, such as bounty hunting, stagecoach robbing, train riding. One is allowed to change the entire physical appearance of their character. The player can choose what kind of hairstyle Arthur would have, if he would have long beard, short, or no beard at all. Also, one could choose the style of beard, mustache, and many other things. The player can choose what Arthur will wear, can clean his weapons to get them into a better shape, which is actually very important. The cleaner the weapon, the better it works. For instance, damage, accuracy, and fire rate might decrease significantly if one refuses to maintain their weapons. Also, if you choose to maintain your weapons, the gunsmith will praise you and tell you how good of a job you have done, which I find amazing. The player could also buy a new horse if they wanted. There are different horses to choose from, and their stats are on display for one to see. Of course, the higher the price, the better the horse. We are also able to buy upgrades for the horse, like the saddle, the blanket. One could also upgrade their weapons by changing the grip, adding the scope, changing the stock or wrap. As I said, one can choose if they will just go exploring the world, and this is where the game gets even better. There are so many small details that took such a long time to plan and put into practice. The player might be riding their horse, chilling, and then suddenly someone might try to rob them. Then it is up to the player to decide if they will surrender or use Deadeye to shoot these guys. Personally, I much prefer the second option. You don't rob Arthur Morgan. Arthur Morgan robs you. Furthermore, the player might come across a wounded hunter who fell in his own trap and needs your help to disarm it. If you choose to help them, then later on they might repay you. I was so surprised when I saved a hunter from a trap. And then a long time after that I went to Strawberry, and there was this guy talking to his friend how I saved his life, and how grateful he was. Then they would offer you any item to choose for free from a store. Just incredible details in the game. There are so many variations of these seemingly random encounters. One might find themselves in the middle of a KKK gathering, which are always hilarious and end up badly for the members of this club. They might end up burning themselves or killing themselves while lifting a cross. If a player decides to kill them, you actually gain honor. Another feature which is very important for the outcome of the game, and if the player ends up being good or bad at the end of Chapter 6. As I said, there are so many variations of these encounters, and I can only imagine how much effort it took to make the game so compelling, so immersive and interesting. NPCs feel as if they have their own lives separately of the main story. They are not insignificant. They all have problems, and the player can hear their stories and help them if they wish to do so. You could also give money to beggars who would give you a warning for the bad events that would happen. Arthur would brush it off as nonsense, but all of these warnings are actually true. The second chapter of the game picks up the pace, but not by much. Of course, the purpose is to gradually increase and improve everything, and not to reach the climax early on in the game. What fun would that be then? Arthur is told that the gang needs money to start over and escape the law. The player has to make this possible, run errands, complete missions, both side quests and main quests. One is introduced to a kind of a loan shark called Strauss, who is a member of the gang loaning money to people, and then later demanding for the money to be repaid by any means necessary. He uses Arthur as his muscle, who forces people to pay the money back. One could then see the brutality of those actions, but at the beginning, Arthur didn't seem to care much. For him, it was like a job he had to do, and he wasn't interested in hearing people's sad stories. All he wanted was to help the gang. Of course, one of those extortions will prove out to be costly and deadly for him, but we will get to that later. The player is also introduced to other features of the game in the second chapter. One can donate money to the camp's funds, buy upgrades for the camp, talk to people, refill his or her ammo or tonics, play poker, play dominoes with Tilly, go fishing with Kieran, go hunting with Pearson, rob homesteads with Sean, etc. So many options to choose from, and all of them are really fun, especially talking to people or listening to their conversations. One time I was just standing there and I could hear Abigail having a complete meltdown. She was yelling and saying that being a mother was the worst thing, and that the others should never do that if they have any choice. I was shocked, considering how much she cared for Jack, her son. But of course everyone has their limits, and I guess she couldn't take it anymore. The player could also see the character development throughout the game. John is at first this immature man who ran away from the gang for a year and refused to acknowledge Jack as his son. But to the end of the game, he is a mature man, taking care of his family and loves both Abigail and Jack. Sadie went from being a poor widow to a bounty hunter who had all the masculine traits, was good with weapons, could handle herself, and was filled with rage for O'Driscolls. She wanted to kill every last one of them. But of course it came to a cost to her soul. She was no longer a loving woman, but a shell of herself. As Arthur told her, they were both more ghosts than people, because they loved no more. On the other hand, there are examples of characters regressing and experiencing opposite thing of character development, like Dutch, for example, who started as a father figure for all of them and ended up caring for no one but himself, manipulating all of them, leaving his, as he called him, son Arthur to die, leaving John to die, Abigail as well. He fell off the rails and it was sad to see. The game has so many different settings, from snowy mountains to rainy and muddy towns, dry towns, huge cities, oily and dirty places. And in all of these places you can visit saloons, go to see a doctor, go to the post office to pay the bounty, buy a train ticket, or get a tip for robbing a stagecoach. There are also general stores where you can buy many different items. Furthermore, the architecture mimics the one from that period. It looked so realistic and incredible. Horse riding is another feature that is levels above all the other games. The mechanics and physics of horse riding are just so much better than, for example, Assassin's Creed games. The game's features also include wolves feeding on a horse, alligators feeding on a boar, birds catching and carrying fish into the air. But let's get back to the second chapter, where Dutch ordered Arthur to save Micah from jail. Arthur didn't want to do it, because he detested Micah. However, he did it reluctantly, breaking him out of jail in Strawberry, where they ended up killing half of the town because of Micah's revolvers that he wanted to retrieve. After this event, Arthur disliked Micah even more, but ended up helping him rob a stagecoach to get more money for the gang. There was one instance afterwards where Arthur asked Strauss if Micah donated any money to the camp's funds, and Strauss said no, to which Arthur replied that he knew it would be like that. And if the player decided to check the ledger, they could see that Micah really didn't donate anything at all. Eventually, the actions from the prologue catch up to the gang, and they are confronted by Leviticus Cornwall, whose train they rob. He confronts them in a town called Valentine, where a shootout breaks out. Many people were killed, and Strauss was wounded. These events lead to the gang having to move to another camp, to a different place because they had to run away from law. Charles and Arthur end up finding a new spot, and while doing so helping a German family that was attacked, and the man of the house was kidnapped. Charles and Arthur rescue him, and Arthur delivers him to his family, showing that he did care about people, even if he didn't want to show it. Dutch was satisfied with the place they found for the camp, because it was easy to defend. Eventually, Dutch, Hosea, and Arthur would pay a visit to a town called Rhodes, which was ruled by the two opposing families, mortal enemies, the Greys and the Braithwaites. The town was very dry. They didn't have rain for a long time. Greys needed rain for their tobacco fields. Hosea and Dutch became friendly with the Greys, helped the sheriff catch some bad guys, and freeing their rogue gang member Trelawney. He was a con man, who would often wander for weeks and then come back to the gang, doing shady business. Trelawney was intelligent, smart, but as Arthur said, he mostly cared only about himself. Hosea and Dutch would try to trick both of these families, play both of them, and rob them. Arthur was acting as a deputy, so he couldn't use weapons or start fights in Rhodes. This town was interesting because it had a contemporary Romeo and Juliet story between Beau Gray and Penelope Braithwaite. Their families hated each other, and they would kill both of them if they found out. But honestly, they were so bad at hiding it that the whole town knew. Even Arthur joked that he knew they were together even if he were in town for only 10 minutes. Good one, Arthur. Hosea and Dutch played a dangerous game, conspiring against both of these families, working for both and against both. They would steal moonshine that belonged to Braithwaites, burn tobacco fields belonging to Grays. Rhodes was an interesting place, because it focused more on bounty hunting, and it was such a great feature, where a player could make more money while capturing or killing a wanted man or woman. If they were wanted alive, then the player was not supposed to kill them, but if they were wanted dead or alive, you could do either. I remember there was this gunslinger that was wanted dead or alive, and you were supposed to use quick draw. I ended up shooting him in the leg and stowing him on a horse. He would end up complaining how I was not a real man for only wounding him and not killing him. Also, I remember this woman that I hunted, and when I found her, she tried to make the man that was with her fight me. And when he refused, she slit his throat. She was so crazy, and when I got her to the sheriff's office, she would keep on talking crazy. There are so many colorful characters like these while bounty hunting in Red Dead Redemption 2. Another feature that makes this game so good. This chapter was like a turning point to the game. The chapter where the pace of the game picked up big time. In the end, the two families figured out what Dutch and Hosea were doing. Grays lured Sean, Bill, Micah, and Arthur, and they shot Sean in the head. Arthur was so pissed because he liked Sean. Sean was actually a really nice guy who liked making jokes and was sometimes a bit irritating, but the banter between him and Arthur was always playful. Arthur himself said that Sean was like a little brother to him after he died. Sean was actually very charismatic with his Irish accent, and funny at times. Rest in peace, Sean. Braithwaites also knew what the gang did, and as a consequence they kidnapped Jack. Abigail was losing her mind, and so did John. This led to an epic scene where almost the entire gang went to the Braithwaites' manor, demanding for Jack to be released. But Braithwaites already sent Jack to Saint Denis to a man called Bronte. The gang would end up killing everyone at the manor except for Mrs. Braithwaite. They also burned the manor, leaving the old woman to look at it burning. They also ended up killing all her sons. A brutal, brutal ending. The gang actually ended up destroying so many lives of yet another town, destroying both families. Yes, neither of these families was actually any good, but still. Of course, the gang could not stay at this place anymore. They were chased by the Pinkertons. They also had O'Driscolls on their tail. They moved to the swamps to a manor called Shady Bell that Lenny and Arthur previously visited when they stole the rifles and killed a bunch of men that thought that the Civil War had never ended. This is where Lenny explained to Arthur the hardships of being a black man and how difficult it was for him. Arthur sympathized with him and said that he was sorry. Of course he was. Arthur is just the best. Chapter 4 introduced a big city called Saint Denis, where it is so easy to get killed. If you even accidentally do something illegal, there would be law everywhere, and you would probably end up dying unless you paid the bounty and escape from them. The gang wanted to get Jack back from Bronte, and Dutch, John, and Arthur would end up visiting him. he would promise to give him back if they did something in return. Saint Denis was very interesting because everything was much bigger there. One could go to the tailor's, order a suit if you like. One is also introduced to a number of very interesting characters, like the painter, who people wanted to kill for making nude paintings of people's wives, mothers, husbands. Such a comical character. But by this time, the player already probably had a lot of money, so it's possible to upgrade everything, buy new weapons, horses, accessories for weapons, hats. The game is just so good, so it's up to you. Dutch received a false tip from Bronte, which ended up being a trap. Fueled by revenge, Dutch killed Bronte by feeding him to an alligator. Arthur's face was covered with horror. He couldn't believe what Dutch had turned into. He became a madman. The gang would try to rob a bank in Saint Denis as a plot for one last score, but it would turn into a disaster. Hosea was killed in front of the bank, John was captured, Lenny was killed on the roof, and the others barely managed to escape and ended up on a boat that sank in a storm. They were washed up ashore on an island called Guarma. This is where chapter 5 begins, and where Dutch, Micah, Javier, and Arthur have to help the natives in their fight against the local dictator, so they could get a boat and leave this place and go back to America. They did all of that. They killed the dictator, destroyed the warship using a cannon, and managed to get back home. However, at this point, Arthur could already see that Dutch was already far gone. But he was so loyal, and felt that he owed Dutch to try and help him, and bring him back to his old ways. In chapter 6, Arthur asked Dutch to help him get John out of jail, but Dutch refused because he became paranoid and thought that John was the mole, the one who betrayed the gang. Sadie and Arthur saved John, and Arthur tried to help the Native Americans who were being manipulated by Dutch. He wanted them to fight the government so they could forget about the gang, and so they could steal bonds and run away. By this time, Dutch didn't care about anyone, and he didn't want to bring Abigail back, who was kidnapped by the Pinkertons. Arthur and Sadie once more saved her, and she killed Milton. Arthur told Sadie and Abigail to leave with Jack while he confronted Dutch and the traitor Micah. It was revealed that Micah was the rat all along. He betrayed the gang for his own skin after Guarma and leaked information. Now the player had the choice if one would be good or bad for the rest of the time Arthur had, because by this time Arthur contracted tuberculosis, and he had just a bit more time to live. It is up to us if we would have high or low honor. One could help the Downs widow, one of the women whose husband Arthur beat to death to collect debt from him. That is the way Arthur contracted tuberculosis. Arthur could also choose to forgive debts to other debtors and give them some money for good measure. All of these actions increase honor for Arthur and impact the ending of the chapter. If one chooses to be good, then eventually at the cliff where sick Arthur is fighting Micah, Arthur would end up staying alive at least for a few moments to see the sunrise and the deer, and then die. If the player chose to be bad and had low honor, then Arthur is shot in the face by Micah, and the player sees a wolf and darkness. This play on good and bad is just brilliant, because after confronting the gang, Arthur is bound to die. But we choose how he dies. The player has the choice. Also, the soundtracks are just brilliant, incredible, and they add so much to his final ride to the camp, as well as his death. It made the player feel so sad, as if your best friend had just died, your brother. At the end of Chapter 6, everyone loves Arthur. It doesn't matter if he has high or low honor. He is the man, the best protagonist in video game history, the best character ever written in video game history. In the epilogue, one plays as John, trying to be a decent man at first, working hard, taking care of Jack and Abigail. But of course it could not stay like that, because Micah could not get away with everything he had done. Also, John could not escape his former life, no matter how hard he tried. After some time, he met Sadie, Uncle, and him and Sadie had a final showdown with Micah and Dutch, who reunited with Micah. Micah held Sadie as a hostage, but John managed to convince him that Micah destroyed everything and that he needs to die. Dutch killed Micah and walked away, with empty looking in his eyes. In conclusion, Red Dead Redemption 2 is the best game I have ever played, and I have played my share of games. It is just so different than anything else that is out there. The story is astonishing, the characters are compelling and colorful. Many different characters blended together, and every one of them has so much to offer. The game has the best character in video game history, and probably the most loved character in video game history, Arthur Morgan. And in contrast, it also contains one of the most hated characters in video game history, in the form of Micah Bell. Also, it has one of the most complex characters ever written, Dutch van der Linde. Some think he's bipolar, some that he's a sociopath or a psychopath. Perhaps he's all of that. Red Dead Redemption 2 has so many features and details that are unmatched, and are discovered to this day 6 years after its release. It has a cult of following. People put thousands and thousands of hours into the game, and they still cannot get enough of it. Yes, it is that good. And yes, it is the best game ever made. Thank you for staying with me until the end. I hope you have enjoyed this video. If you have, like and subscribe. I would appreciate it so much. Thank you and take care of yourself.